We'll take your questions in a second, but I'll just comment on something that, again, came to mind as Orlando was talking, and perhaps in the broader context of conflict resolution, how sometimes we rely on trigger mechanisms. And if Guantanamo can be thought of as a trigger mechanism, certainly the 38th parallel in Korea is a trigger mechanism, American troops in Berlin, and so on and so forth. So at times we may think of those kinds of situations where trigger mechanisms come into play as part of perhaps not solving, going back to the taxonomy that I introduced earlier, not solving, but perhaps resolving or dissolving international disputes. So with that in mind, questions, please. Anyone? Yes, sir.
Yeah. Hi, Eric Williams. It's for both, but I guess for Susan specifically. The other day reading up, I didn't realize how large the British Commonwealth was under the Queen, about 2.5 billion people. And I related to that because of the election of the new Pope, the 1.1 billion Catholics. And so I'm thinking Latin America, of course, falls under the Spanish same law patterns. So there's a similarity. Do the Commonwealth countries, there are about 50 around the world, other than India, Pakistan, always had a conflict. Do they also have less problems with boundaries since they're under the Commonwealth?
My impression is no. Maybe for one reason is that the people are all very different in the Commonwealth, culturally, ethnically, racially, etc. I mean, it's very, very heterogeneous compared to Latin America. And, I don't know, Britain's power has been waning, ever since World War II. And how can I put it, that the powers that surround what was the Commonwealth, or what is still the Commonwealth, are much more powerful in many ways than Britain is today. So any of the Asian parts of the Commonwealth, or India, whatever, I mean, that they essentially, the geopolitics is different now. The point of reference for most of, or many of the Commonwealth countries is not Great Britain at all, but it's kind of what's going on around them, and you've got different power constellations that have very little necessarily to do with the Commonwealth. And even if you're in the Commonwealth, I mean, it hasn't prevented any kinds of conflicts or resolving stuff between India and Pakistan, for example, and the Middle East, that used to be part of it under British rule. So I would guess I would think it's the homogeneity, and also I would say that perhaps the different points in history when the various countries became independent. So they all were going into a different kind of global power constellation at the time. The interesting thing about Latin America, I don't remember what the Latin words are for it, but that you had independence occurring for the region, almost all the countries of the region, basically at the beginning of the 19th century. Cuba is an exception, of course, that was later. And there seems to have been some kind, I don't know the details of it, but some kind of acceptance of this concept that the original boundaries are the boundaries. Where, now of course I myself have talked about boundary disputes, but they haven't been as major, except maybe in the case where Venezuela claims half of Guyana, or 2/3 of Guyana is really Venezuela, or where Guatemala claimed Belize was. I remember when I was traveling through Central America a couple of decades ago, and you'd look at a letter with a stamp, cancellation of the stamp, and it's canceled, and it says Belize es nuestro. So that shows you where. So, but those have basically involved littler countries with very. Actually, and different cultural things, because Guyana and Venezuela, for example, Venezuela was Spanish American, and Guyana was totally different, and even Belize and Guatemala. So I would say no, that there was much more acceptance of borders that grew out of the independence movements, in part in some kind of legal concept that starts with a J, but I don't remember what it is, and the greater homogeneity of the region itself.
I only want to add just a little bit of that, because Susan had mentioned earlier the legalistic tradition, and I don't know to what extent the common law versus the Roman codification of law plays a role in that in the Commonwealth as well. But I would suspect that culture does. I recently wrote an article which I call the Wiki Constitutionalism in Latin America, because whereas in North America, Canada has had two constitutions, the United States one, Latin America literally leads the world in terms of constitution writing. I think the Dominican Republic is the leader with 37, and so on and so forth. So we treat him like Wikipedia type of thing. The hypothesis, or one of the hypotheses that I advance in this particular article, is that in Spanish we have reflective verbs that we do not have in English. And I got the idea.
I'm sorry, what's the reflective verb?
Oh, I'll tell you in a second. Carlos Seide, when he was writing his book, he made this point, and I quote him on the book. In Spanish, he uses the example, I'll use this example. If we're going to school and the book falls, we say, se me cayó el libro. The book fell from my hands. It wasn't my fault, it was gravity or the damn book. Se me cayó el libro, se me perdieron las llaves. In English, we assume responsibility. I dropped the book. But in Spanish, we sort of absolve ourselves from responsibility and we blame something else. So to what extent all of those things play a role in these kind of things, I don't know, but they're fun to think about. Questions? Dr. Shishlicki?
I can't hear too well. Speak loud.
No se te oye.
Given the fact that now extraterritorial powers are more involved in Latin America, China, Russia, Iran with Venezuela, can we anticipate a period of deepening conflict between Latin America or a number of Latin American countries and the United States? And the second part of the question is, if this country support the position, let's say, of Bolivia about an outlet to the sea, is this can generate conflict, governments and countries taking risk in taking certain policies because they have the support of these other powers. So what is the impact
Of the outside powers.
the outside power? So what is the implication of the changing relationships in Latin America?
Interesting question. So you asked in the first question if, with this extraterritorial involvement, does that mean that in Latin America that there could be more conflict with the United States? First, let me ask you, give me one case where you think it might work like that. I mean, that Venezuela would.
Venezuela
with Iran.
for example, or Russia was interested in ports in Latin America. They may have a closer relationship again with Argentina like they had during the military dictatorship there. There may be dynamics here that we haven't looked at in the future.
Yeah.
One example, Susan, you might want to think about is that we've known for some time that Hezbollah operatives are entering the United States with Venezuelan passport being issued by the Venezuelan government, for example.
Well, in the short term, I think no, because, I mean, just for the reasons that we all know about, that the United States is not looking for new kinds of conflicts to be in. And also, I think that part of it is that, you know, Latin America is not an area of banana republics anymore. I mean, there are a few countries that still act like banana republics, but in any case, you've got local, you know, sub-regional or regional powers. You've got even some institutions, for better or worse, you know, that try and resolve things. But if the United States gets really worried about what Iran is doing, my guess is it will deal with Iran, not necessarily with Venezuela. And you know, in the same way that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were upset about what Castro was doing, inviting the Russians in, and what the Russians were doing. We went right over the heads of the Cubans and dealt with the problem, which was the Russians. If it should happen with China, for example, I mean, China's influence in the Americas has been expanding tremendously. So far, it's mainly been economic, but of course, in some areas, it has some political spillover. For example, if you look at, I mean, this is not China's fault, but that many of the countries with oil, in South America in particular, are basically among the, what I call the elected authoritarian regimes. I mean, they have democratic elections, but they're basically caudillo-governed regimes. The way to deal with that, I would assume, if it ever happened that China became much more openly challenging of U.S. security interests, would be to deal with China, not to deal with Venezuela or Peru or whatever. So, and if the Latin American countries, I mean, I think the key issue is security. I mean, the only, you know, we're not that worried about China yet, as I just said, and for reasons I just said. We're not that worried about Russia. Basically, what Russia's been doing is just really upping up its arms sales. So you've got, you know, an arms race again, particularly in South America. Either from Washington's point of view, those kinds of issues can and should be solved by the surrounding countries, which I have to admit often don't act very fast about it, but, you know, that's right. But, I mean, or you just, it spills over into the more important relationship, which is the United States and Russia, or the United States and China. So I don't think that the United States would necessarily end up in conflict with Latin American countries for the positions that they take on this kind of issue. The United States might get involved with the issue, again, with the more powerful outside country, even if the Latins say you don't have to, there's no real threat, et cetera. I mean, the perception and the decision as to what constitutes a threat to U.S. security is basically in Washington. It's not in Latin America, but it's much more efficient to deal with it abroad. Now, this raises another interesting question, which is, now that Chavez has died, you know, what is the future of Alba, for example, and even of what's the future of Venezuela? And because it was really Chavez in his incarnation as, you know, a son of Bolivar and of Fidel Castro, although he didn't seem to realize that the two of them had very different kinds of values and goals, but he picked things selectively from the heritage. Oh, I'm sorry. I think, you know, with Venezuelan oil production having already decreased by about 1 million barrels a day from 3.5 to 2.5, with the United States fracking revolution, where we are moving toward becoming energy self-sufficient. I'm not saying oil self-sufficient, but energy self-sufficient within, the estimates are 5 to 7 years, perhaps. With the fact that the United States, for the first time, is not the main importer of oil, it's China. And the reason for that is U.S. oil production from fracking has increased so much that many of our Gulf Coast refineries, for the first time, have not imported a drop of foreign oil. This is going to impact Venezuela also. So if you look at that, if you look at the fact that the Venezuelan economy is becoming a basket case with rampant inflation, for example, and just the whole infrastructure falling apart, et cetera, it's not clear. Oh, and then Maduro is no Chavez. I mean, Maduro is, my impression of him is he's not, what do they call it, the brightest light bulb in the room or something like that. But also, he doesn't have any charisma. That doesn't mean things will fall apart right away. But one, his personality is deficient compared to Chavez, and two, his resources are going to be deficient. And so will the 100,000 barrels a day that Venezuela's been shipping to Cuba be sustainable, and the whole Petro-Caribe project also. So without someone like a Chavez, beating the drum and whipping up the conflict, to me, it may be that we're going to have a less contentious kind of adversary in the Venezuelan regime than before. And maybe this division that we've seen between Chavez, Venezuela, and the ALBA countries, and the democratically elected countries that really are behaving to various degrees democratically, maybe that'll be blurred over. And maybe the Latin American democracies may end up through their own sub-regional institutions, if things really get threatening in some way, that they may be quicker to, how can I put it, they may be more willing to take a stand. They haven't been taking much of a stand against Chavez. And part of the reason is that I think part of it was the fear that if they take a stand, Chavez will work with the left in various countries and start causing problems. That was the fear about Fidel Castro, also in the Central American conflicts and earlier. And also they didn't want to give the United States an opportunity, to get involved. And they also, this is a solidarity thing. They didn't like not to show solidarity. But anyway, I foresee. So I guess my short answer to your question is, in the near term, I don't think that this will produce conflicts, that the involvement of these foreign countries will produce conflicts between the United States and Latin America, unless there is a huge perception of difference between what the Latin Americans are saying is okay and not a security threat. And the United States would say, well, it doesn't look okay to us. We see it as a security threat. But then again, it won't deal with the Latins. It will deal with the security threat.
There's a second part to the question.
What's the second part? I'm sorry.
The second part was whether this interference by extraterritorial powers from extra-hemispheric power will embolden some of the governments and leaders in Latin America to take actions that we dislike or the U.S. dislike. For example, there's been a transfer of $6 billion in Russian weapons to Venezuela, in addition to the relationship with Iran. While I agree with you that Maduro is in trouble and the economy is weakening, there are many instances in which governments that are weak and have crisis internally use external events to strengthen their nationalism.
Right.
Their
Well, yeah.
So will this lead to a reassertion of Venezuela against Guyana or against some of its neighbors?
Okay, yes. I mean, this is Kirchner, again, raising the Malvinas issue. Venezuela might think of doing it in a more militant fashion. I mean, frankly, what I saw from the Venezuelan army's functionality, and I'm not a military expert, but remember when there was this conflict, I guess it was when Colombia went into Ecuador and got the computers or whatever it was, all of a sudden, Chavez says, okay, I'm sending 10,000, military to the border. Well, this was a joke. I mean, if the 10,000 military could have had any kind of success against the Colombians that were sent to the border, it would be astounding. The same happened with Argentina. Argentina was bluffing. They were basically thinking that, as I said, that Britain wouldn't challenge them just because of the distance. Their military was in woeful shape too, and now after so many decades, in many of the democratic countries at least, but even in the non-democratic or the non-acting democratic countries, the military, I mean, if you look around, the Brazilian military is good. I mean, it's capable. The Chilean military is capable, and the Colombian one, particularly after the cooperation on Plan Colombia, and probably the Peruvian to a certain extent because it's had to fight, various incarnations of Shining Path. But some of the more, I guess what I would call some of the countries that are more hostile to the United States, and maybe more willing to use, this nationalistic argument because their economies aren't doing well or whatever, they don't have great militaries. I mean, the countries that have Brazil is very reluctant to use its military, and so I don't think they'll use nationalism to try and bolster themselves. Maybe they'll start taking things to international courts or something like that. But if they try something like, some kind of use of force, either they'll, if there is a conflict, they'll lose it, or they'll do this moral hazard thing where they'll figure, okay, well, now it can go to some sub-regional court or OAS or maybe, and play it out that way, and they won't necessarily win. So I guess I'm less concerned about that happening in Latin America.
I have a question here, and then Director Miller.
Okay, great. Sean Foreman, I'm a professor of political science at Barry University. And Dr. Purcell, when you mentioned the vote in the Falklands, I wondered why the British don't want the Falklands, and my friend reminded me.
Why they don't want?
Why they would still want. I mean, why? And
Oh.
for sort of the obvious reasons, and he reminded, well, the same reason the U.S. still wants Guantanamo. But that would bring me to Orlando, and that's my takeaway from this. I'm fascinated to learn that part of Helms-Burton has this provision.
Yeah, I didn't realize it either.
The handing over of Guantanamo. How did it pass Congress, right? With Helms-Burton sponsoring this, I'm just surprised. I don't know if you could illuminate a little bit on, was there any discussion of this? And then, what's to stop the U.S. from reneging? What are the criteria for ultimately determining that we have a free, fair, open, constitutionally based government in Cuba before this so-called takeover would happen, or hand back would happen?
You want me to do the Falklands first, or let him? Okay.
Yes.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I'll go. Before answering that, first of all, I'm thinking of 3 recent things I found as I was preparing for this, which are indicative of how powerful an image or a metaphor Guantanamo is for Cuban nationalist self-perception. One is a State Department cable from, I think it's 1957 in Cuba, 1958. There's an insurrection going on, and the State Department was very bothered by the fact that the Batista government, which was receiving substantial U.S. help, had decided to start selling sugar to the Soviet Union. And they said, why is Batista doing this? We're backing him up and he's selling sugar to the Soviets, which to me was a discovery. I thought Castro had been the first one to sell sugar to the Soviets. The second thing is, the State Department official complains that every time they sit down with Cuban military officials, instead of discussing the war and how to defeat the insurgency, they keep bringing up the issue of Guantanamo. And it seemed to me outlandish that in the middle of an insurrection, the Batista military was still saying, okay, fine, but hey, what about Guantanamo? When will it be returned to Cuban hands? The second thing is, in the past 10 years, a lot of the secret papers having to do with Operation Mongoose and U.S. efforts to overthrow the Castro regime in the 60s have become public. Another fascinating jewel that I found was in the midst of secret negotiations between Manuel Artime, who was probably the foremost anti-Castro leader of the 1960s, and the CIA. They're discussing transfers of weapons and other support for the anti-Castro insurgents, and then Martinez says, but as soon as we constitute a free government, we take care of the issue of Guantanamo. And the third thing that comes to mind is, in the 1990s, right after the Rafter Exodus, the 1995 Rafter Exodus, Jorge Mascanosa proposed in Washington that Guantanamo be created as a free Cuban zone where, in his own words, we can set up a Cuban Taiwan and show the Cubans how free Cubans can live under rule of law. So it's always been there. It's been a constant metaphor for Cubans. How did it pass Congress? Number one, Guantanamo in the 1990s was not an important issue. It was there were discussions of closing it down. It was mostly it had become a place through which Cubans sought freedom. Then all of a sudden, when the Rafter Exodus takes place, Guantanamo becomes an issue again because it became the place where Cuban refugees could be placed as they were processed into the U.S. So the approvement of the Helms-Burton bill takes place after the shoot down of U.S. civilian planes over international airspace. There's an outcry over that. Clinton wanted to put something forward as quickly as possible. Helms-Burton was on his table, and he passed it. Guantanamo was a non-issue at that point in time, and there was great pressure to undertake some kind of action short of war against the Castro regime. That's how I think it passed. Everything has changed after September 11th. There's a new international environment. But what we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking is that any Cuban leadership, be they the successors to the Castro brothers or a democratic leadership that will emerge on the island, will dismiss Guantanamo. It's going to be an issue for Cubans. And if we get into, as long as there's a Cuban nation state, Guantanamo will be part of the logic of that nation state. Because every Cuban nation state that will emerge will want to control all of Cuban national territory, as is natural for any nation state. So it's a pressing issue for the United States and Cuba. Can the U.S. go back on that? The Helms-Burton bill codified U.S. policy towards Cuba. It states that the U.S. will not formally recognize any Cuban government and will maintain economic sanctions until all political prisoners are released, until political parties are legalized, until labor unions, independent labor unions can organize, and until independent, and until
Chronology?
a chronology for free elections are declared with international supervision. It's 4 conditions. When those take place, the U.S. Helms-Burton bill says you have a legitimate Cuban government on your hands. Oh, and Fidel and Raul Castro must be out of power. So when those conditions are met and a government is elected, then according to the Helms-Burton bill, Guantanamo must be returned to Cuban sovereignty. It's there. And it's a result of this nationalist self-image of Cubans and the ability of Cubans to more and more successfully lobby within the U.S. power structure. One last thing, and it's interesting to me how, in very different ways, both Castro and his opposition agree on that one issue. That at one point in time, Guantanamo must be returned to Cuban sovereignty. Anti-Castro Cubans, it must be returned to a democratic government. Castro, it must be returned right away.
Susan,
Could you just repeat your question? I knew it's about the Falklands and Britain, but,
why is it still so strategically important to the British?
oh, well, it's several things. It's not only strategic. Part of it is that Britain doesn't want to suddenly pick up its people, in a sense that these are all British descendants, and tell them to go live elsewhere. I think if there had been a different outcome to the referendum where the people would have voted overwhelmingly to join with Argentina, then Britain would have been probably more willing to let it go. It has more strategic significance for Argentina, obviously, to have that as a kind of a base in the South Atlantic. But really, a lot of the motivation also is what I mentioned earlier, oil, minerals, fishing, etc. So I don't see any way with the kind of referendum you just had that Britain would abandon its descendants or whatever. Britain, how can I put it? Let me put it positively. It had to take a Maggie Thatcher to actually pick up the challenge and fight the war so many thousands of miles away. Who knows if Argentina were to attack again, and declare war again for whatever reason, whether Britain would act that way or not, or whether somehow immediately even the settlers would call on some kind of international whatever because they've been attacked. At first I thought that Argentina's claim, was in many ways indefensible when she criticized the referendum after, 3 people voted against continuing with the relationship with Britain. I think she does have a point in that when you have a referendum where the so-called colonizing country, from their point of view, is calling the referendum and supervising the referendum, that could be shaky if you tried to take it somewhere. I don't think the Pope will take this up, but for all I know, Argentina could try and bring it to an international court, but if the other party doesn't want to go, then. So I think as long as you've got the situation where the settlers are it's not that Britain can't do without it, I don't. It's more that I think it's almost a moral kind of obligation to these people. And frankly, maybe if Argentina were a more functional country and, behaving in better ways, that maybe more of the settlers would have said, okay, let's have some kind of relationship with Argentina. But at this point, it frankly didn't surprise me that they didn't want to transfer their sovereignty over to Argentina.
For turn over to Orlando, and I think part of what I'm hearing here, whether it's Guantanamo or whether it's Las Malvinas, is the role of domestic politics in international conflict resolution. Because clearly we can point at the economic aspects of it and so on and so forth, but it appears to me that domestic politics are just as important, if not more important, than some of those other economic deterministic type of answers to that. Orlando, I think you wanted to add something?
No, just really quickly, I think that essential to the self-image of any nation state is territory. Territory is essential to identity. And oftentimes in the U.S., we see ourselves as a nation of ideas, and we dismiss territorial claims of other countries as something that we don't quite understand. Whereas in our own history, territory has been indispensable to constructing our own self-image and who we are. Washington's instructions about the sovereignty of the Ohio Valley at the end of the war against the British is an example of that. And just really quickly to add to Argentina and what happened with the Falklands, the Argentinian military, and it's fascinating to read this as trying to understand nationalism, the Argentine military had convinced themselves that due to the close alliance they had with the U.S. in defeating their own communist insurgency, and the fact that they were neck deep in arming, training, and promoting the counter-resistance movement in Nicaragua, the U.S. could not dismiss their claims on the Falklands. And I've spoken with diplomats who participated in these negotiations with the Argentine, and they kept on thinking, when the Argentines would bring up the Falklands, we thought they were joking. How could that be real? It was very real for the Argentines. It's real to this day. You can't dismiss it, but there's certain, it's very easy to say, why would a nation state go to war with these tiny little islands off the coast of Argentina? It's part of their national self-image, and that is a very powerful part of politics.
But I do think what you think what you said, the calculations about how Britain would react, and even if I remember correctly, even Jean Kirkpatrick, who had written her PhD thesis on Argentina, was actually more favorably disposed to the Argentine side, but it was Maggie Thatcher talking to Ronald Reagan and, trying to kind of stiffen his backbone or whatever words she used, something like that, that actually played a big role. I'm not sure without Maggie Thatcher in power whether Britain would have done what it did. And so the Argentine calculations, weren't crazy. It's just that they had someone else. I don't know, for those of you who've seen the movie, what was it with Meryl Streep? What was it called? The Iron Lady. Some of that comes out. I mean, she was a real strong person willing to buck everybody, domestic and foreign, for what she believed was the right thing for Britain to do.
Director Moore, I think you had a question, but Susan just mentioned something else, and I keep thinking about the peripheral topics here in resolving international disputes. How about leadership? Because Margaret Thatcher was, it's also having to do with individual persons, individual leaders. Director Moore?
I'd like to draw attention to the OAS, also related to the multilateral or bilateral solving skill of international confrontations. My experience told me that in the early 2000s, the territorial disputes between Belize and Guatemala, both are our allied countries, and we also, Taiwan even was still not an observer of the OAS, but we tried to help. And through the OAS, we did some donation support to help the dialogue between these two countries keep going. Mm-hmm. So this is the one thing we did with the OAS. However, right after this, the People's Republic of China, mainland China, they also pay high attention to the OAS, which they didn't, hasn't before. Eventually, he became an observer in 2004 of the OAS. Now my question is that at this moment, I don't see that China play an active role in the multilateral organization of the OAS. And Taiwan, of course, we do our diplomatic relations through the bilateral relations. How about the United States as the leader of this region? I wonder what is the policy of the U.S. government when they're trying to deal with these regional security issues, including territorial disputes. I remember that in the early 2000 or the late 1990s, the State Department's attitude to the Southeast Asia is always focused on the bilateral working relations. And then I think they gradually realized that the regional allies, ASEAN and beyond, getting more and more important. So now we see the State Department doing this, dealing with this region more carefully and with a group discussion. I don't see the OAS can play the role as the ASEAN or other forum can play now in Southeast Asia. So will there be a new mechanism or possibility to deal with the regional security issues? Does the American government still trying to do the things bilaterally, or they want to consider the external threat, external influence from the other hemisphere to this region in the long run regarding to the resource concern? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't, you know, there has been a proliferation of regional, sub-regional organizations, some explicitly concerning security, others more development, all kinds of things, which exclude the United States and Canada, as a matter of fact, on the grounds that, you know, these countries have now developed sufficiently, matured politically sufficiently, etc., that they can take care of their own regional conflicts. I think there's probably a growing attitude in the United States, and actually it's my attitude too, that we don't have to get involved in everything in the region, that a lot of these countries are perfectly capable of solving them or trying to solve them themselves, and that our strength right now is basically in working for democracy, rule of law, strengthening that, and the economic development. In terms of the OAS, I think there's a chance the OAS actually might be able to work better in the coming years, depending whether what I think is going to happen to the ALBA countries, whether that happens or not. Because the problem with the OAS is that it works on consensus. I mean, you almost need a certain kind of unanimity on all these issues. But even if it's not the OAS, I mean, these other ideas where, you know, if there's a problem, so 4 big powers of the region get together. So I don't, and then actually more countries in the region have also started turning to the UN, or, you know, international courts or whatever. So I think you've got a whole menu of potential options now, and not all of them, or actually I would say most of them don't go directly to Washington. The exception, of course, is the Caribbean Basin, where, and Mexico, but we don't have, I mean, except for security assistance, Mexico is perfectly capable. Mexico goes both ways. You know, there are certain things it wants, and the United States will work with it on that. The other things it tries to be part of the hemisphere. But I think there is, you know, you can do the UN now, you can do the OAS, you can do the international courts, you know, you could do ad hoc coalitions of the willing to try. So I don't see the United States pushing for bilateral resolution of the majority of conflicts, with one side of the bilaterals being the United States.
Sir, you had a question earlier?
Yes, I had a comment. Eduardo Ramirez, I'm actually with U.S. Southern Command. Sir, question for you. You know, Alistair Cook, who used to, before he passed away, with the BBC, he made a comment once that was interesting. It surprised him how the United States always had such tension with Cuba, but yet it quickly embraced China, communist Vietnam, but with Cuba it was always a special case. But the comment I have is, don't you think with the precedent that we set with the Torrijos Carter Act, when we basically gave the canal back to Panama, that we would do something, most likely, in the future? If a democratic regime does, you know, is consolidated in Cuba, that would be something that we would consider.
I think there's 2 issues. One, there's always a comparison between U.S.-China policy, U.S.-Cuba policy. I think they're 2 very different issues. But what is interesting is basically by what Congress has done, the U.S. has remained committed to Taiwan's defense, to the defense of the Republic of China and Taiwan, and it has remained committed to democracy in Cuba. There have been actions of the U.S. Congress. Also, in the case of Taiwan, the PRC had accepted, a two-China policy under Nixon. It was Carter who broke off relations with the Republic of China and Taiwan unilaterally. With regards to Cuba, I think there's a very good probability. I think there's a very good chance that once Cuba is democratic, the U.S. will hand Guantanamo over to a freely constituted Cuban government. What I'm saying is it can be a very effective tool for bringing about that day. Because again, we can't be dismissive of Cuban nationalism. It's been a fact 90 miles away from us for 200 years. It's not going to go away. It's a fact in Miami. And Miami has shown that it can influence Washington, like the Helmsburg. So we shouldn't dismiss it. It's there, it's real, and it's not in our best interest that it be democratic and not authoritarian. The other point that I wanted to quickly add is, I think we're at a very dangerous moment in Latin American history. Because yes, most of the countries are formal democracies, but the region is leaderless. A region that had leaders like Duarte and Calderón Sol and Cerezo and Calvani and others now has no leader of note. I mean, Chavez stood up because there was no competition. And sadly enough, when Latin America is leaderless, it drifts towards what it knows best, and that's authoritarianism. And that's what we're seeing in the region, because there's no leadership. There's no leader with a vision of how to bring about democracy, of how to integrate the nation states. We have party leaders, we have dogmatic leaders. When you see Brazil's foreign policy, you see how leaderless Latin America is at this time. There's no, the great statesmen that Latin America had at one point in time, they're not there. And I think this will lead to a retrogression towards types of authoritarianism in Latin America, like we're seeing, for example, in Argentina.
I think Susan wanted to add as well.
Thank you. I actually see it the opposite. I think that you've had strengthening of democracy in many of the bigger South American countries and Mexico, not without problems, obviously, but we're coming. It depends in part on what happens in the United States and how the United States is seen in Latin America. Now, we just came through a 10-year commodities boom, global. And that created some interesting ideas, impressions, and forecasts on the part of Latin American countries, again, particularly South America, the commodities-producing countries. It was part of this thing where they looked at the world, they said, China's a rising power, the United States is a declining power. China's the wave of the future, the United States is not. Then, of course, they look at our gridlock political system, and suddenly democracy doesn't seem that great, and also there was not as great a promotion of democracy in recent years as there used to be. The commodity, whenever there's some kind of boom, everyone always thinks, oh, it's forever, But we'll see. Lots of times these projections don't work. But in any case, if there is a prolongation of the commodities boom, the United States is going to profit from it. So, and the U.S. economy is starting to recover, et cetera. So, and China's growth has declined somewhat. It's still growing at a healthy clip, but not like it did. And more analysts are pointing out to certain domestic problems that exist in China. Don't forget, one of the reasons that Mexico was coming up again, and in fact, Mexico may be, the coming years, Mexico may be growing much more than Brazil, even though Brazil is a commodities producer, is in part because the rising labor costs in China have closed the wage gap, more or less, between China and Mexico. So you're getting a lot of insourcing now of companies, U.S. and other companies, that are going to Mexico, or they're going back to the United States. And so let's see, what happens with the Chinese economy. I don't mean that China's collapsing or anything like that, but if you and of course the death of Chavez, and I've already gone into that, you put all that together, the United States is looking better and potentially, more attractive as a model. At least it's going to be very difficult, I think, assuming that we don't suddenly sink economically, for people to keep saying the U.S. is a declining power. And if everything is relative, we're not the declining power. I mean, and let's see what happens with China. So all of that, I think, and what I think will be a weakening, if not some kind of de facto dissolution of ALBA may actually allow some of the ALBA countries to start rethinking whether they're going to put all their eggs in this ALBA basket. Nicaragua, interestingly enough, was always playing both sides. I mean, they were with ALBA, this, that, and the other, but they also had and wanted to sustain good economic relations with the United States. There may even be a chance for Bolivia, actually, not only because of what's happening globally, but internally in Bolivia, that economy is in trouble too, and there's more dissent. Let's see what happens in Venezuela. In the short term, the odds are Maduro will win this very skewed election, which is being played out on a very unlevel playing field. But students have already gone to the streets. It's one thing to protest the leader of the revolution, whether it's Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, or Mao Zedong, but once that person passes and you get a kind of, whether it's Chavismo without Chavez, whether it's Castroismo without Castro, etc., people perceive that there's been a game change. Maybe they don't have the exact dimensions of it right. And so you got the students out on the street, and who knows? And Capriles, if you look at what Capriles is saying, even though he may not win, he is much more willing to attack the regime than he ever was when he ran when Chavez was still alive. So I kind of think that while there may be more political conflict domestically in these countries because they're not going to grow as fast. And if you look at Brazil, it's clearly not growing as fast. On the other hand, these countries have come a long way. So I kind of am a little more optimistic. Central America is another story. The drug scourge is just creating potential failed states. Honduras now is like the #1 candidate. Guatemala hasn't been doing so great. But in general, I'm a little more optimistic about South America.
Can I make one quick comment?
Sure.
No, my point, Dr. Rousseau, is that democracies are basically moral structures. And when you have the president of Argentina stand up with a picture of Assad and say, this is the man we support. And when you have the president of Brazil go out of his way to empower Iran and to support the Castro regime, that has inevitable moral consequences for the legitimacy of their own democracies.
Yeah, but Dilma's not doing that with regard to Iran. I mean, they're still keeping up relations with Iran because Brazilian-Iranian trade for some time now has been very, very profitable, I guess for both sides, but clearly for Brazil. Argentina, I mean, there's no investment. Foreign investment isn't going in anymore. And I think that Cristina, it's true what you're saying, that she's, moved herself closer on the authoritarian side of things. But she's not a model for anyone, I don't think, except maybe some people like her Parisian clothes. I don't know.
Well, as you know, if you get two scholars together, you get three different opinions. So that's part of it. And the polls as well. Well, I'm going to add one, and I hate to use the term because I know we have some political scientists on the room, but I see it somewhat a little different because I think there might be something analogous to a hegemonic party systems developing in Latin America, certainly in Venezuela. And I know we had the but that whole definition of hegemonic party systems, I see something along those lines developing. Dr. Roy?
I'm sorry, where do you see that?
I have
Venezuela, certainly.
a quick question and an issue that have to do with the drug cartels. We don't have that much time, but briefly, what could be the impact of the powerful, growing violence of the drug cartels in Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and in a transition in the future of Cuba?
We'll make this the last question porque se nos acabó el tiempo. No fue culpa mía.
I think number one, I think that we have to be very aware of something. Most Mexicans voted for the PRI because they want the old PRI back. They want a strong party that can bring back authority to the country. The drug cartels have become so powerful in areas of Mexico that they are the authority there, and you have to deal with them formally because they're in control. I think you have the rise of a paramilitary movement in Mexico to counter the cartels. We have a very serious situation in Mexico, and Mexicans want authority. They want order because they know how terrible chaos can be. And I think that's one of the things that's driving a return to authoritarianism in the area. I think that in the case of democracy in Cuba, those who are struggling for democracy in Cuba must be aware that they must pin their international alliances as closely as possible to countries who have succeeded with democracy. Be it in Eastern Europe, be it in Asia, with Taiwan, be it in the United States, be it in Canada. I think Latin America is in a very dangerous situation. And another thing that worries me about Latin America and why I think there may be a drift towards authoritarianism is due to the fact that Latin America has ideological problems with democracy. I think Lula has ideological problems with democracy. I think Vilma has ideological problems with democracy because that's not the system they fought for. It's a system they had to accept when they lost the insurgency. And I think that can lead to an authoritarian bloc that has a very bad influence on any young democracy like Cuba will be.
In the Cuban specifically, in a vacuum of transition in Cuba, what is the danger of drug cartels moving into Cuba?
I think it's very great, and I think the drug cartels are always looking where to go into. But I think what also worries me is the fact right now you're seeing Brazil pushing heavily for Maduro. They want continuity, they want stability, and I think they will push for a succession of the Castro regime in Cuba, be it under who it may be, and that's very dangerous for free Cubans, those who want democracy in Cuba.
I agree that countries want stability, particularly when they've been actually decimated by drugs. But the idea that Dilma isn't really for democracy or some of the other countries, I think you have to distinguish between you can be for democracy and be very strongly for a market economy. Or you could be for democracy and really believe very strongly that the state has a big role to play in the economy. And I think that the tradition of the Labor Party, and of course Dilma maybe ideologically, is that she likes the idea of a big state, she likes industrial policy, she likes the state, setting rules. But I don't see any evidence yet that she's not democratic. And now in the case of Cuba with the drugs, I agree that it depends how chaotic things will be. Interestingly, if you compare Cuba with Venezuela, even though you still have the Cuban caudillos living, you have had much more time for Cuba to kind of become a bureaucratized type of authoritarianism because the revolution's older. Fidel's been out of it for a while. I don't care who's signing these articles with the name Fidel Castro. He has been incapable of writing them, I would say. And Raul Castro, Ramon is the other one, but Raul Castro is sort of like what they're trying to do in Venezuela with Maduro. And the fact that Raul just named this guy no one had heard of before, I don't remember his name. What is it? Diaz-Canel. It's almost like the Cubans did with Maduro. They picked the one with the prettier face, who was younger, because Diosdado Cabello in Venezuela is not. And he was he would have been more independent because he has his own ties. He comes out of the Venezuelan military. So the Cubans picked Diaz-Canel, Diaz-Canel, and Raul just picked another pretty face. I don't remember his name either. He was first vice president of something or other. And they're going to put a more youthful, attractive kind of head of basically what they hope will be bureaucratic authoritarianism, where you get Chavismo without Chavez and you get Fidelismo without Fidel or Raul.
Just to close on that, I think in the appointment of Diaz-Canel, we have to remember that the Roman Emperor Caligula named his horse to be in the Roman Council, so to make a point that a horse can be a senator. Well, thank you all very much for being here, and we'll take a short break right now.